Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Power of Custom Fields in Drupal. And I'm looking for best practices and real world use cases, although some fake ones as well. And today I'm going to introduce namely the Field API, which has a long history. It's well maintained, and it's used for all the different ways you can add data into Drupal, retrieve it, and maybe access it in meaningful ways beyond just the data itself, plainly. I hope you leave this session with a better understanding of the powerful tools here at your disposal to make custom field types, field widgets, field formatters, but also have sort of a sincere appreciation for the dangers that go with creating custom code and supporting it long-term, and that you find that they are the right tool for the job in some of your projects. My name is Jim Romero, and I'm an engineer at 4 Kitchens. I have over 10 years of experience working in Drupal, and I use it for all my nerdy hobbies, from running calculations on homebrewing beer to planning retro arcade projects, even for teaching kids to survive the zombie apocalypse at a local summer camp. Drupal powers it all. And I'm just really excited to be here at the webcam. If you have any questions along the way, I don't necessarily have the Zoom faces here, but feel free to drop a question in the chat and I will do my best to look. And if our moderator wants to ever interrupt because there seems to be something really great, let's do it. I want to make sure that we use the best use of this time. And depending on the folks that are in this room, I could take this presentation a few different directions. In fact, if you're interested, feel free to drop in the chat what your role is in your organization. If you consider yourself a site builder and you're constantly working in the Field UI, if you're a backend developer who's writing custom code regularly and maybe comfortable with object-oriented patterns, if you're working in the front end or even a full stack space where you're constantly in templates and different control structures, because I will dig into the code as comfortable as this group is interested. On to today. So we're going to talk about the Field API, and really it's 3 permutations, 3 different types of plugins that are going to be especially relevant. What is custom fields? And that's where we store data in the database. What are the custom widgets? And that's the view of that data when we're editing it or adding it. And finally, custom formatters, and that's the way we're displaying that data. None of this is earth-shattering. If you've done even an introduction to Drupal, you're used to using the Field UI module to add and move fields. That's this custom fields, to change where they are on the form. That's the widgets. And then also the display modes and how they're rendered. That's the custom formatters. We're just going to create our own options on these today. Case for custom fields. I will admit, it's not as strong as it used to be. If you've been around Drupal long enough, you'll remember CCK, the content construction kit. It was earth-shattering. It was this neat idea where we can build our own content types. And it was really the reason I ended up going with Drupal on most of my web projects, because if I was using other CMSs or something homebrewed, there wasn't an easy way to say, add a date field to this, add a file upload field. In fact, the file upload one came much later. But with Drupal, it was sort of an assumption out of the box that we were going to have things that were fieldable, and those things eventually became entities, started as nodes and keeps evolving. And so this idea of things being fieldable is exciting, but you're limited to the number of fields at your disposal. And so what you'll see in a lot of sort of old school Drupal sites, and it's still not necessarily wrong, is kind of an abuse of the different types of fields. So I might have a bio, and I have a phone number field, and it's a string, varchar in the database, birthday, cost, IP address, Twitter, address. And this is serving its purpose. You can add and remove fields, and this would have been extremely common to have lots of fields just sort of dumped to the page, and it would lead to some problems. This phone number field could come in lots of different flavors, even without validation, because I think these are all accurate numbers, but they're a different way of interpreting what I'm supposed to do with that input. Am I doing dashes, hyphens? Am I using parentheses? Can I have an extension? Can I use letters? How about country codes and internationalization? So the text field that comes in Drupal can be used for a lot of things, but probably shouldn't. Let's show a couple other examples before I get too preachy. Cost. If you've ever worked on an e-commerce site, This is always a loaded question. How are you going to store your prices, especially when you get to changing prices, adding discounts, internationalization, fractional pricing, things of that nature? Because there are so many different ways to represent a price. And if it's an open string field, place whatever you want in there, then someone could put the word free. That's completely valid. And on a product page, it might look good. It's not going to work so well if you're creating a view and you're trying to sort by price, because now you have, I guess free goes to the bottom of the list if it's sorted by its natural sort, where it would be numbers first and then letters. Or what about this case where we have some complicated instructions? So it's not, again, I'm not against using this, but it feels like we should store the data in a different way. Let's do a couple more of these. Birth date. Oh, I've had fun with this one over the years, because I mean, in this case, someone adds 12/5 versus 5/12. I don't actually know with confidence which sort of date system they're using. There's lots of different ways to internationalize dates. And I don't think we have to worry too much about Y2K anymore, but 2-digit years do creep up every now and again. The preach here is just simple, that with just basic strings, you can only go so far. It will capture your data. You can store that in the database and render it, but you're going to be limited on how you can filter, what kind of processing you can do on that. And you're not going to have a lot of confidence. Probably not even going to be able to validate it without really annoying your user. Luckily, we have some tools at our disposal. The other reason for using custom fields, beyond just how the data is stored in the database, is when you want to add some sort of a complex shape to your data. And there was a project years ago called field collection, and that's kind of what I always think of here. And there are other ways to do this, but let's assume I had a set of fields, and I'm using this for a profile. All these fields have a relationship with one another. I'm trying to build some sort of a name identity. And some of these are required. Maybe the last name is always required, and that's all you need. But if I'm building a profile page, I probably want something more friendly than that, especially in the marketing sense. And so maybe I make it that first name or prefix is required. So I could be Mr. Vomero, I could be Jim Vomero, I could be Mr. Jim Vomero, but I have to have some combination of those things. These fields have an inherent relationship with one another. And by creating a custom field that has multiple values, I now have the opportunity to apply my business logic to those. And we're going to use this as an example when I open up some code in a little bit. The other place you'll see this often is the address field. And I'm just really thankful this module exists. If you haven't used address, it's from the Commerce Group. They have put a lot of logic to say if you change your country, different fields may or may not be required. Words like state, which is a select list right now for US states and territories, might change to a set of provinces or an open display field. Zip code changes to postal code. So having these interdependent relationships between the fields is key. And while I could, on a content type, individually add fields for country, states, street, city, state, I guess address line 1, 2, there's no meaning to them. Their meaning comes from when they're together. And furthermore, if I wanted to add it to multiple content types, I'd have to duplicate that effort in multiple places, or I'd have to do something fun with custom entities or paragraphs or something of that nature. So custom fields, and I'm going to call this a custom field because at one point it was. It's a contrib module now. Custom fields allow you to add this complex shape. Two other great examples are a date picker, and we're not, writing out database looking dates, or this phone number picker is a Drupal contrib module I used in the past. It's kind of fun. Optional extension, country code, makes it a little more foolproof. And so to just wrap up this custom field part, it's probably not something you'll use often. When we get to the demo part, we're going to see that Drupal already has a lot of options out of the box, and you probably don't need a custom field. In fact, almost everything you could store in a string, but is that the right tool for the job? So there's 4 things that I've kind of identified in those past examples that I think are relevant. When would you need to create a custom field? If you want strict data type checking, if you want to make sure that your number is a number and not just a string that so happens to be digits. If you want to create a new data shape or relationships between the data, I think the address field or all the sort of person name identity was a good example of that. If this is where we get into the database stuff, if filtering, sorting, and computing values is a priority, you're going to be in a better position to do those kinds of database queries if you own the field. It's difficult to do a lot of joins and calculations in a clean way. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. You can have complicated queries, but I at least want to call it out that if performance tuning and making your code more readable is important, making your queries more readable, having a custom field opens up some possibilities. And finally, reusability at the field level. I want to acknowledge that some of these things I might create as a paragraph or as a custom entity or a custom block type. So if I had back to the profile example, a list of boards and places that a person shares or contributes to organizations, that might be a custom block or a paragraph in Drupal, and you can add all of your memberships and affiliations to it. And that's great. Those blocks are great in that they are reusable and they're fieldable and they are translatable. Where they start to fall apart is it's yet another place data is stored, and it's not stored close to the entity itself. So when you want to start doing, once again, complicated filtering, sorting, computing, you have just this superficial relationship of my person's name information is stored over here in the database, the actual profiles over there, and I need to start joining those things together to have any kind of meaningful interaction between them. So these are largely database questions, but I wanted to bring them up, kind of introduce the concept here, a little abstract. We'll look a little deeper in the examples. All right, I'm talking a lot, but let's get some visuals. Case for custom widgets. So the custom field, I said you probably won't do too often. That's how things are stored in the database. The custom widgets is what is the author looking at on a node edit form, for example, or a node add form. What are they looking at when they're adding data? And you're used to these. You have text inputs and file upload fields, and there's lots of different types of widgets. And they've evolved over time. And one of the reasons that you might want to create a custom widget, and here was a classic example, is just to enhance the authoring experience. So the date range field is fantastic. This is a solved problem. You don't need to solve it again. But it's a good indicator of where we've come as a community, that there was a time where you may have added some really ugly time codes into Drupal. And that was your way of representing date times. And now we have some nice little fancy pickers where you click on the calendar, there's a pop-up, you're given a set of values that make sense, that are human readable, and also they're valid. I can't accidentally pick a time that doesn't exist because you're in daylight saving time. That has happened on one site I worked on. It was kind of funky. And so you've created a better experience. Now you can create as many of these widgets as you want. We'll look at a couple examples here in a minute. In this case, it's a drop down. I click on the date or the time icon and I get a drop down. But there's lots of fun date pickers there. And if you go to CodePen, you can see endless lists of them in the JavaScript world. You could add them to your site through a custom date picker widget. Another one that I was fortunate to see go away is if you've ever worked on a site where you had to have a longitude and a latitude or some sort of geocoded location. These were rough days. Now there's APIs to do all of this work. And so some of these already exist in the Drupal space. Others, it's going to be an opportunity for you to create a custom field. Like I said, this one's also probably a solved problem, but I think it drives home that idea of something complicated needed to happen, where I knew that I wanted the Pittsburgh Convention Center saved as the location for this event. But for the sake of the map API, this website's going to make a map so people can get driving directions at the click of a button. For that API to work, I need a longitude and latitude. And I've worked on sites where you told people, go to this geolocator website and get the longitude latitude and put it into Drupal because we need it for the widget to run correctly. That's silly. There are tools that are better for that, but they don't exist in Drupal core. So you either need to find a contribute module or you need to create your own. This is a code example from Google's Places API, and you could paste that in a widget and use it on your site. And now, well, as you start typing, it's going to query a list of places, and it will send back all the location information, including longitude, latitude, and other things that are relevant. So you're able to simplify complex tasks. And then the final one, I'm kind of using this as a blanket, just encapsulating complex controls. One of these is a fake example. I'll let you guess which one. by default, Drupal widget's going to use all the different things that you would see in a Forms API. So I want to add a text field, I want to add a number field, a date field, whatever those could be. But the sky's the limit. You could put whatever you want in there. We just saw a map where you can pick your location. Why not put a HTML5 canvas element and let people be able to sign a document? This is an image field, but the widget is something that's interactive. And so anything that you've seen in the wild where it was a really neat user interface, maybe even a decoupled interface, decoupling the editorial experience in just the form of a widget with some sort of a JavaScript library, the author doesn't need to see what goes in the database. In this case, it would be an image. The author needs to see the HTML5 canvas so they can sign their name. And I just got to give a plug. There is a Reddit community that I've always gotten a kick out of. It's like Bad UI Battles. Fantastic options out there. And I wanted to build a bunch of them for these presentation, but it turns out that's an irresponsible use of my time. I really wanted to, though, maybe one day. And one of my favorites I saw was a password field that as you type your password, it says, no, you need a unique password. This password's already used by Mike. Go find your own. I say that, I actually put this one up here partly as a joke, but in all reality, when you start taking over Drupal responsibilities, you probably don't want to do password fields. When you start taking over these Drupal responsibilities, it's now your job to maintain that code. So any of these sort of widgets I'm showing off are fun, but there's a responsibility that comes with that kind of code. And I just wanted to scare you a little bit. All right, let's summarize the custom widgets. When's the right time for those? Anytime you hit a wall, usually it's when you've outgrown what Drupal forms can do. Even something as simple as a slider, sliding left to the right to pick a number or a range, is not something you see in Drupal core by default, but you can add it very easily actually with a custom widget. Or that HTML5 canvas where people want to draw a picture or take a picture from their webcam or record an audio clip. These are all things that are solved, HTML5 ready issues, but they're not Drupal core components. So if you've outgrown those, if you want to change the data so that what the editor sees is not what's literally stored, maybe it's a calculated value. Someone puts in their address and it calculates the distance to, and that's what we need to save because for payroll, we need to calculate how far they traveled, and that's what they're being reimbursed for. Anytime you want to add complex business logic or validation, that's especially important with like a series of controls like the address ones. A custom widget is your opportunity to put in as much logic as you want or to integrate with external services. I'm seeing this more and more often now, where maybe I add an embed code and it reaches out to SoundCloud. It's going to download a screenshot and some other assets, maybe a still frame or something from a podcast feed, some stats. So integrating with that service so your author doesn't need to fill out a bunch of fields. We can have all that running in the background. And the last one, I'm going to keep this one short because this one, I think everyone's empowered to do. The case for custom formatters. And a formatter is really just, how are we going to display that data? So we know something's in the database. What's it going to look like? And in the case of that date field I showed early, what's stored in the database isn't pretty. It's some sort of ISO standard 8610, something like that, date format. We don't want it to look like that. We might want a little icon next to it. Maybe we want that date format to be a countdown to the number of days. So a formatter is a way of saying, take that data and transform it in some way so that when it's rendered in the node or the view or wherever you're using that data, it has a format or a presentation. And you can have some fun with these. I think I just put in a couple examples. Oh, just one example. And that's a link field. A link field already has a bunch of formats. You can, in Drupal at core, when you add the link, you can render that as just the link. You can render it as a clickable link or a link with a title, a static title or one that you give it. You can also render this, I think, as like separates, like the link title and the link URL. But why not create your own formatter to render it as a QR code? Everyone still does those, right? We'll look at an example of that. In fact, that's the very next thing we're going to do. A couple examples of ones that I've done actually in the recent past for custom link formatters, creating an office hours widget where the author in the widget was putting in all of the times that they are available. but that was just a laundry list of I'm free these days, these times, not these. We calculated it. We built a calendar. So students were able to see when that person was available. So the data stored was kind of confusing, but the calendar was very user-friendly, the thing that was rendered. We did one recently where it was like a bibliography or citation sort of field. You would add, just like the name example, add a number of fields about a publication. And then we had different custom formatters for each of the citation styles that you might have in higher education. I did one on a recipe blog not too long ago for converting measurements. So if you wanted to have someone put something in at cups, but you want to know what that was at teaspoons, we can have it render as such. So being able to, at the formatter, change your, on the fly, change your measurements, or also if you want to double recipes, things like that. And oh, at that time card, I think I mentioned that one before. I created one for the summer camp business I mentioned at the top, where folks would fill in all of their time card data. And the widget was complicated. It had lots of information. But the thing that was rendered to the screen after they submitted the node, after they submitted their time card, was just the things that were important for accounting. So they could see total hours worked, and that was a calculated value. They didn't calculate that, but it was a calculated value for total hours worked, total distance traveled, any incidental expenses, and these were things that could be reported to accounting. So separating that authoring experience, which was very important, from the calculated result through this this custom formatter. All right, I've been talking for a while. I want to look at some code. By all means, I'm going to keep peeking over at the chat. If anyone has any questions along the way, throw some in there, because this really can be a choose your own adventure. I'll also mention, and I'll have a link in the last slide, that all of my code today I put up on GitHub. It's at my namespace and Jim Field API demo. So if you're interested in what any of these examples are, take a look, try to break them, see what you can do with it. I would say in general, programming knowledge isn't required for everything I'm about to show you. You'll appreciate it more if you're familiar with things like Drupal's Field API or Form API or some validation or object-oriented programming basics. But I really just want folks to leave with an understanding of how easy or hard it is to change these structures in Drupal. And I think everyone, if you're a technical decision maker, I think you'll get something from this next part. Oh, thank you, Luke. All right, let's look at it together. I have it over here. Well, let's actually look at the site. I made a very simple site in Drupal. Add content, profile. And this is where I got my screenshots earlier, is I was curious what would happen if I started to create some of these fields. So let's pretend I had a profile at the university. There's my name, and I'll be doctor today. I'm not a doctor. We can pretend. I was lecturing at a local university, and the students kept calling me doctor, and I felt very special for a little bit there, but I did correct them. And my nickname, let's just go with Jim. And so you can imagine in this case, and this is where I'm just using normal Drupal out of the box fields. There might be different places I want to render this data. Maybe the node itself has a title that's very marketing friendly. This is Jim Vomero's bio, but somewhere there might be a professional section, or maybe there's a CV type generator that's going to use a full description or some sort of professional association, professional identity. Or maybe some of these fields are synced in from a catalog or a central database. So when I click save, I don't think I have any required fields. I have some fields. Awesome. And the thing I want to show off, I should zoom in. My apologies. I realize not everyone is on the same screen size. What I would like to look at is just get a base understanding of what's going on in the database for folks who haven't seen this kind of stuff before. I don't actually know how to zoom on here, so we'll see if it's easy. If not, it's something I'm not going to mess with it. I should have thought of that beforehand. My apologies if you need to squint to see some of these, but if you've never cracked open the Drupal database before, what you'll see is every time you create a field, there is some sort of a collection of fields, depending on translations and things of that nature. And every field gets its own database table. In fact, it's going to get two at the very least. And in this case, there is a database table called field name prefix, and that's where doctor is from that most recent example. In fact, every individual field is saved into its own table. That's useful. Drupal's doing a great job. Drupal's there's a concept of normalized versus denormalized data. And so one of the things that's nice is you can take more control. Let's say instead of this, I'll show you the code for it in a moment. I want to create my mega name field. This is my own custom field. This is a single field that has multiple inputs. And this is the one we're about to look at as our first example. And in this case, I'm going to go other. Ooh, wow, fancy, Jim. I should add a laugh track to digital conferences. I'll be president. James. Better do the full middle name on that one. And I'll be President Jimbo. So this is my custom field. We'll take a peek at what's going on, but I just want to save it. I don't think I actually ever rendered it to the screen, so it's not being rendered, but we can still look at it in the database. And then we'll see how we got there. This one's called mega name or something like that. There it is, mega name field. And I don't know that you have an excuse to do this. I might do this on a project right now, but really this is an example of any time you want multiple values stored in one field. And the thing that's important here is everything that I just entered is stored into a single database table. That's not something people think they have the power to do in Drupal out of the box, but this is important, especially if you have multiple dates that are part of a workshop series and you don't want to chase those dates all around the database and piece them together with some sort of tagged logic. You can put all your information into one table if that's the appropriate data schema for you. This makes it easier to filter, to sort, and to do calculations. And so if you're really into performance or database tuning, this may be of interest to you. How do we get here? Well, let's look at some code. And at least there I can zoom in a little bit more. So my apologies if you couldn't see it. And this is what you were looking at if you got that GitHub link. Let's zoom in. I created a module here. It's a custom module called Fun Fields. I don't know if they're actually fun. They're probably mostly boring, but we could pretend. If you're unfamiliar with writing a Drupal module, especially in modern Drupal, there's a lot of rules you have to follow and a lot of boilerplate that comes with it. So I'm going to say a few times in a very dismissive way, like this is all boilerplate. And what I mean is it's the same code everywhere in Drupal's universe for reasons of discovery or for design pattern reasons, accessing the service container correctly, whatever it may be. There's just a lot of code that doesn't necessarily do much. And I'm going to kind of skip over it and I'll mention that. I'll just hone in on the parts that matter. The code is all important, but once you create one of these, you can copy and paste it all day. And so the pattern here for all Drupal fields is in source plugin fields. This is where we're going to create our custom fields. And the first one to create is a custom data type, something I said we probably won't do too often, but hey, we just looked at a field. Let's see how I did it. So the mega name field. I'll scroll to the top and we can see it has that namespace, a field type. And this is sort of the boilerplate I'm talking about. Like all of this is incidental. I'll key in on the parts that are important. I gave it a unique ID. And I said this field can be used by default with this mega name formatter and mega name widget. I mean, maybe I wanted to use a different formatter. It wouldn't make sense here, but a link field could, of course, be used as a link, or it could be used as plain text. So you can have different formatters and different widgets for the different field types. In this case, I have a one-to-one relationship. My custom field has a custom formatter and a custom widget. Made it easy for us to have a demo. The only thing I think I need, maybe I need empty, but the only thing I absolutely need are the schema declarations. And so I'm showing you the bare minimum in this file. I'm linking off to some information of what all this is, but this schema method tells us what we're putting in the database. So I'm going to have some new columns anywhere I use this field. This isn't creating a table in the database because you can use this field on another entity and we'll create a different database table. So this is a template for starting anywhere you want to place this field. And I created some fields called prefix other, first, middle, last. And it's nothing earth-shattering. I gave it a size so it can be allocated correctly. And that's the schema definition, Drupal schema API. The second one that I need is then this acts sort of as a middle layer because PHP in general is very loosely typed. We can do a little bit more descriptions. setting things like, I don't have too many here. This is a place where you can do things like adding constraints. I want the data to be from this list and get into like integrity issues, or the data has to be a number greater than 10. You can get really into this with the data definition, but this is pretty copy and paste as far as our example is concerned. There's a field called prefix. It has the name prefix and a description, a professional title or salutation. And so those two things together, the top one to create the database table and this to act as an interface to it, are what's going to set us up for having our own field type. The last method, I actually don't know if it's required or not, but I always include it, is an isEmpty method. And this is just the one Drupal is going to use to see if there is any data of value. And so for me, I've decided if I don't have, oh, that's funny, I put suffix. I didn't mean suffix. Let me change that right here. It's already set required, but if for some reason I don't have a last name, we're just going to consider the name empty. That for my business reasons, without the last name, I cannot print this wherever it's going to go. And that's why you need to create a custom field type. It's nothing that interesting. It's a schema definition. And once you create it, it appears in your lists. Profile, manage fields. And so if I would like to add a new field, add a field. You've done this before. I'm in the gin theme, so things might be a little unfamiliar to you, but it's the same as before. I have mega field. So we've now created a new field. It's not a string. It's not an address. It's not a link. It's a mega field. And every time I do this, it's going to create either a database table, or if it already exists in an entity, it's going to use the existing one. Any questions on that? I kind of going to pass over custom field types because you don't need to use them a lot. I do have one other example. I'll show it off after I finish this name one, and that's, can we store color as RGB, 3 numbers? The place I've seen this used in other patterns are like that geolocation. I want to have longitude and latitude, or I don't know, I'm running a jewelry store and I want the 3 C's of my diamond. So being able to have combined attributes as separate places, but they all exist in the same table. But similar concept, you create a schema, you're good to go. Now that doesn't do anything. I need an author to be able to put data in there. So I need a custom widget. And you may remember at the top of my data type, I said that this data type is going to have a widget. The default widget is called mega name widget. And so following the same naming convention under source, plugin, fields, field widget, I can put any of my widgets and Drupal will discover them. So as long as it's in the correct folder. I have my mega name widget. And I have the declaration here. I'm saying it's a field widget. And there's my mega name widget. One of the best ways to learn what's going on in Drupal is just to get, this is the plugin annotation. It's a different API, the plugin API. Worth learning is you can search for something like this at field widget and just see all the ones that are currently existing in your Drupal site. It's one of the best ways to learn. If you want to see how countries work, how phone numbers work, you'll get a sense of what else is going on in the Drupalverse. Let's
Jim,
look.
we have 2 questions in the chat. I think
Perfect.
might be related. Luke asks, so anytime you need to record a vector, it justifies a multi-field or multi-value field, excuse me.
I think so. I think that data doesn't make sense to be separate. And so putting it together makes a lot of sense to me. The only time I've ever shied away from it is because I do a lot of work and as an agency, I have to deliver it to a group that has to maintain it. And so if I'm ever doing something really complicated and I don't want to give that group something that they don't have the developers to maintain, what I may do for something like that is create a widget that has multiple fields, but then maybe I serialize it and I just store it in a string. So that's sort of a balance there. It's a cleaner implementation to have a custom field type, and that way you can have 2 columns, one for each component of the vector, but you technically could shove that in a varchar. I don't like doing it, but I'm a data purist. And I see the other question here. How can one migrate from one element schema field into something else? The prefix from the varchar to the string. Migration is tough. And I don't know if I'm going to answer your question as intended, but I'll say I rarely change schemas after they're declared. It can get very messy when there already exists data in there. So what I almost always end up doing is adding additional columns to existing tables is not too hard. You can change the schema definition. It won't update your database. You're going to need an update hook to do that. And in some cases, additional configuration files in your exported config. And so it can get a little messy, but I pretty much never delete something that exists. Drupal has a bunch of integrity checks. And if data exists, it gets a little nervous, and rightfully so, and I'd rather not fight it. So I will end up keeping legacy data in the database, sometimes changing its description so people know not to mess with it. And unless there's a business need to get rid of it, I get a little shy. Did that help? All right, let's look at this. Oh man, I was trying to go slow because this is a pretty dry topic, but now I'm going too slow. Let's look at the field widget. So I mentioned that you got to give it a name. There it is. And I'm saying it's useful for the mega type. And here is my widget. I have just a constant with all those prefixes. And the reason this was a kind of a fun example, the only method you need is form element. And the reason it's kind of a fun example is I just have that conditional field. So I have, if you've used the Drupal form API, this shouldn't be surprising. All this is normal Drupal forms. I have an element called prefix, and I'm saying, and I gave it an ID of prefix selector. If prefix selector has the value of other, then this becomes visible and this becomes required. Let's see that in action. So a doctor, that field doesn't exist, but as soon as I go to other, now I have this field appeared and that field became required. So a trivial example, but I think a powerful one, in that you have complete control over the editorial interface, and you can apply any level of business logic you need to that widget, including validation, post-processing, type checking, whatever it may be. If you normally do it in a Drupal form, now's your chance. But all of this, I'm kind of going to skip over. If you work with Drupal forms, I don't think any of this will be surprising. It's just a form. Maybe the only thing worth calling out is this pattern right here. Each item, as it's called in this method, each item has a property that has the same name as the machine name of the data table. So nickname, suffix, and last are the exact same thing that we saw in the schema definition. Nickname, schema, and last. So as long as you use the same naming conventions, you can get the data to the right place. And that's it. Like that's creating a custom field and adding a custom widget, and it's actually not all that interesting. Maybe I could show one that's a little more interesting. Did I do this one? Oh no, that was good. That was just a screenshot I took for y'all. All right, let's do one that's just a little bit more interesting. And that was, let's create a custom type for storing colors. And this could be something else. This is probably most similar to that time card or office hours example, where I had a bunch of related data and I was going to do a calculation on it before rendering it. So in the schema, and this one's called, let's just get our names, it's called RGB. And I have a formatter and a widget for it. In the schema, I've given it 3 columns, red, green, and blue. They're all ints. It's going to be a number from 0 to 255. If you've done any CSS, here's where I mentioned before, you can give it a little bit more type through these constraints. And I have some links to some resources there if you're interested in learning more about it. But all 3 of these are a number, 0 to 255. And yes, this is verbose, but I mean, I can read it. If any of them are empty or null, then let's consider this value empty. And I probably have some data in here because I was experimenting before this meeting. So let's look at what this looks like in the database. What did I call it? Color something? I don't know. Yell it if you see it. If not, I'll there. This one does it. So I see that there it's This one's holding the value 241, 120, and 146. And so that's all we've done is we've created in this a custom field that holds 3 values. Rather than creating 3 separate values, they have a relationship, but we need the author to be able to do something interesting. And I wanted to do it 3 different ways. So the default widget, we could have lots of widgets for the same field. The default widget, RBG default widget, it's called value fields, is a very boring form. Using Drupal Form API, I have a field for red, a field for green, a field for blue. And let's see what that looks like. Content, add content, basic page. There it is. That's fun. I don't think any visual designer is going to appreciate that, but it works. Color scheme. We can do better. Yeah, that's not interesting. We can do better. So let's create yet another field widget. This one is going to be a color picker. And it's just using a HTML5 element that's in Drupal core. You can have a field of type color. And so instead of having those 3 values, 3 fields, one for red, one for blue, one for green, I have instead this one field, which is a picker. And it loads a nice little HTML5 color picker. I did have to create 2 methods to convert them because in the database, I'm storing it as RGB, but this picker likes hexadecimal. So I'm doing a little bit of work to add the hash sign and to convert them. But that's it. Let's look at what that one looks like. There it is. I didn't write this. This is in Drupal. Maybe you've used it. I don't know. And it still has those values, but it is picking a color. Now, something important's happened though. The form no longer has the red, the blue, and the green associations. And I said recently that the only way to get data in is that you need to save it using the correct name. So call it item green, item red, item blue. Well, that exists in this form. It doesn't exist in my new color picker form. This only has an element of item picker, which doesn't even exist in the schema. So there's a different method I want to introduce, which is why this one becomes a fun example, is massage form values. Yep, we can just mess with them in real time. And so I have the ability to take the color, which is hex, loaded when someone submits the form, and break it into its constituents. So I can save item red and derive it from that, green and blue. And so let's just make sure it happens. I'm going to make it a nice Fort Kitchens green. I don't know if that's Fort Kitchens green, but it looks good to me. And when I edit it again, the value should still be there. Hooray, it worked. Let's do one more just for fun. I got this from a code pen. I was just looking for a fun color picker. This is randomly generated colors. Boom, 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 boom. And I click one, and now that saves. That was like a red. And I see it saved down here. So that was the random color picker. I wanted to use that as an example because it's a very different widget. In this case, I have the picker itself, I'm loading with JavaScript. And so I'm just placing a blank div. And the constituent colors, red, blue, and green, I have as hidden fields. So there's a couple of things I have. I'm loading JavaScript via a library. That's really outside this talk, but I wanted to at least give you an example where it was happening in practice. And, oh, I have a template in a different example. Let's just look at the JavaScript while we're here. JS color picker. This is my JavaScript. I mean, I altered it a little bit, but what I'm doing is randomly generating that. And when somebody clicks the thing, it's going to copy the values to those hidden fields so Drupal can submit it. So nothing ultimately clever. In fact, it's not even very hardened code, but I thought it was a more fun example. That's kind of my intro. I do have a few more things I can show off, but are there any other questions on a field formatter or a field type or a field widget? We can look at a formatter last.
Do you have any examples on how you serialize them to just kind of like have one?
I do. Let's see. let me Google it because I don't want to bring up client code right now, but Drupal Field serialize, there is a method that does it for you. And let's see if I can find it. I'm not gonna be able to find the documentation quick enough. So if there's time at the end, I'll try to look it up off screen to show some code. But what's really neat that I'm doing for one organization is we've created a field, and the widget is like a mini version of views, like Drupal views. So it has a drop down for selecting your content type, a drop down for picking taxonomy terms, a drop down for doing your display mode. And in the end, there's going to be a whole bunch of these. And actually, we're replacing with icons. It's going to be pretty slick looking. That's a lot of fields to maintain that could change over time. And I don't want to have like an infinite number of columns in my database. That's not helpful. So instead, I have this form, but on save, I'm using that massage method to take everything they submitted. And I think I have it in, I think right now I have it in a JSON object, but Drupal will serialize it for you and put it into some sort of a blob, or I don't remember what it does when you set serialize. But it takes all of those values and serializes and stores them just as a string. It's like a text field or a big text field. And so you pack it on save, you unpack it on load. A little harder to query because all of it's serialized, but it was getting really complicated. We expect it to change over time. I don't want to change the schema over time.
So does the widget interface all come from the annotations, or did
Yeah, let's look at that. So when we created a new field type, we saw it here with adding a new field. When we create a new widget, so it's like manage fields. This is the fields, the widgets, the formatters. So when we're in here, we can see that these are our new widgets. And I scroll down to that mega one. It's actually the only widget registered to work with that field type. And you're right, that comes through the annotations. So the mega widget is right here. I'm saying that if you have a field that is of type mega name, then you're allowed to use this widget. And so it's being pulled in there through this annotation. You'll have to clear caches to see it. But in the example of the color one, which is a different content type, structure, content types, I had that on a basic page. I created 3 different widgets for them. And that's why you can see all 3 of them on that custom color field. And you can pick which widget you want to use. Maybe
so
for-
are each of those 3 in annotations, or I'm trying to grasp that.
So I didn't, you don't have, like, you can create just one of these. You don't have to ever have a widget. You can have a widget without a custom data type, just a new widget for a string. In my case, I do have custom ones in these examples. So here's my new field type. It's called RGB. And if I go down to the widgets, the 3 color ones I created, the annotations for them say, this applies anywhere you have a field type of RGB. I have a new widget for you. And this is its name, RGB value fields. The second one also applies to any RGB fields. It's called color picker. And the third one applies to RGB, and it's called a random color generator. So by having these annotations and making sure you implement the interface correctly, you get all 3 of them here in the select, and you can decide that when I add this field, what do I want my authors to see? And in the case of the time card system I wrote, I have different widgets depending if you are the employee adding your hours versus the accounting department that maybe has to make a correction.
Okay, so the annotations throw it into that pop-up menu. Like if you change the labels in the annotations, it would change the labels in that pop-up.
That's correct. Yep, that's coming directly from here.
Got it.
The other thing I'm not showing off, because I just didn't want to get too complicated for this session, is there are methods here for adding the settings. And that's this gear. So you see, I don't have any settings, but you can, you can add an entire mini form for settings. And so maybe for this case, you want to say, allow opacity as an alpha channel for your colors, or don't. So you can add settings for any of your widgets or any of your formatters. But that was just a little too much to fit into one presentation. Great question.
Thanks.
Let me show off a formatter because I know we're getting close on time. And first is the color formatter because I just want to show an example of a template. So just like before, I created a new formatter. There's this annotation. It's called field formatter. If you're interested in what all your other favorite modules are doing, just search that annotation and you can see all the different ones that exist in your Drupal site and learn from them. But for mine, it has a unique ID, could be whatever I wanted to call it. It applies to the RGB fields, and it's called RGB format. Our formatters appear on the Manage Display tab. And it's the only one I've created for this. I didn't create it to do anything fun. I probably could have done something cool with like creating overlays or, I don't know, changing theme settings across the site. But I just wanted to print the values to the screen so I could show what it's like to have a custom template. So the only method needed in a formatter is view elements, and it requires you to return a render array. So if you've worked at all in Drupal's render engine, a render array, there's lots of ways to make them. In mine, I just had a custom template. So my template's called color components, and I'm passing 3 values to it, red, blue, and green. This is declared in my .module file, but it also exists. You can see it in action right here. There's my template. This is something I can do all my calculations, my business logic in PHP, somewhere that's following a lot of, rigid best practices, and then pass it off to the theme engine, which is fine, but it's not as strict. It's harder to annotate. It's harder to do complicated logic in Twig. So if I need to calculate the distance between 2 cities, I'll do that in the field and then pass it to the template so my themer can override it or do whatever they want with it. I wanted to do one more as an example, and just to kind of prove that you don't need to create a custom field every time you want to make one of these. Formatters, I make them all the time. I have some data and I want to show it in a different way. Maybe I want to take this name field and truncate it for some reason. I don't have an example. I don't have a good example, but if I wanted to URL encode a field, if I want to translate something, I might want to create a custom formatter for that. And let's see, do we have any good ones? Do I have a link field in here? Address, oops, nope, that's the basic address. That's the basic one. Let's go down here. So you can see that the Drupal default date field has several formatters: a time ago, a custom, a plain. The phone number field, local or versus international. The address widget, no, that's not the one. One of these address ones. I didn't organize my node form, so I don't know which fields are which. You can create your own formatters, and I wanted to do one as an example where I'm using an existing field. So formatter, a QR code. Exciting. Everyone's still doing these, right? I still don't know for sure. Can I take, in this case, I have, once again, a unique ID, but I'm applying it to the link type. That's Drupal's type. I didn't create the link type, but now I have a new way to render a link. It has the name of QR code. And I'm just using the Google Chart API. So I have that only method I absolutely need. You can do some settings and some other stuff, is the view elements method. And I need to return a render array. And I'm returning an image with this URL. It's a Google Chart sort of generation URL that takes an encoded version of a URL from a link field and puts it here, runs it through a template. And that looks like, it's this one. So once again, this is not something I created. This is Drupal's core link field. I just said, I want to take that data out of the database and show it in a different way. And so this is where I end up making quite a lot of formatters when I need to do very surgical or even complicated changes that just aren't appropriate in Twig. I actually dug in a lot deeper than I thought I was going to be able to today, but it also meant that I probably went a little faster than I should have on some of the basics. So if you have any questions, I would love to keep this conversation going. Let me actually just close out my slides because there is more conference to be had. I am NJim on all of the things. So you can find me on Drupal Slack. I'm not on the social media as much anymore, but you can try to find me. We'll find each other. LinkedIn, GitHub, also a fun place to collaborate, or just send me an email. I love to chalk shop. I'd love to keep this conversation going, and I'll stick around here as long as any you want if you have any questions. But thank you so much for letting me be a part of your conference. This is fun, and I actually think these are pretty addictive. So I hope you find some good reasons to create these, and that you just are very thoughtful before you start creating some schemas, and make sure that you're going to want to support them for 10 to 15 years. That's kind of my rule. Thank you all so much. Any other questions? I really do love this stuff.
Do you have other talks on similar things that you want to point us to?
For me, or just in general?
No,
Because
well,
there's some good stuff out there. I did a talk.
both, but I meant you.
This was inspired by a talk I did for years on creating custom entities. And that was the thing that really opened me up. If you've never had the chance, we looked at some annotations here. These are pretty small compared to the entities you get when you create, say, a custom entity, not just the node, but your whole new entity. There's some great reasons to do it, but a lot of responsibility. I've had a lot of fun with that one, and you can find that on like Drupal TV and all over the YouTubes. But I'm most passionate about authoring experience and user interface. So anywhere I can make it easier for someone to feel like they own their site makes me really excited. And I have a few talks on that.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop the screen share, but feel free to reach out. This is so much fun. And thank you so much for keeping this conference going. I haven't been able to get to all the sessions I wanted to, so I'm really excited to see these posted.